Titans, go! You know, I'm not sure there's a superhero property that has been as drastically reimagined in as few adaptations as the Teen Titans. Because when it comes to the non-comics versions of these characters, and setting aside random one-off appearances here and there, there's basically the 2003 Teen Titan animated series, the far sillier Teen Titans Go and its affiliated movie, and now the live-action Titans series, which is dark, violent, and pretty much devoid of jokes. It makes one wonder if that first animated series was like subject to some mad science experiment where its component parts of overwrought drama and abject goofiness were split into separate entities, like that time that Bruce Banner and the Hulk became separate people, or the whole red and blue Superman thing from the late 90s. Oh, the 90s. Well, look, however we got here, today I'm going to be taking a look at that dark live-action version that premiered last year. So, prior to being commissioned by a Patreon supporter to cover this, I really had not followed much about it since the somewhat infamous first trailer, which featured Dick Grayson, aka Robin, delivering this immortal gem.
Fuck Batman.
And that pretty much killed any interest I might have had, dead in its tracks. That trailer as a whole, that line in particular, painted the whole thing as just this edgelord nonsense that falsely equated dark with mature. Now, I don't have a problem with dark material, but I'm frequently frustrated by it because I feel like so many creators think that the dark and edgy version of something is somehow self-justified. But the best dark stories, especially dark superhero stories, they have a depth that makes the darkness go down well. Where it becomes painful is when a story just wallows in being dark and gritty, but doesn't appear to be using that aesthetic to any narrative end. There isn't a reason to do it. And I really dreaded that being the case for Titans. So imagine my surprise when the show turned out to actually be pretty good. Not perfect, there are problems, I'll get to them, but the problems it has aren't the ones I was expecting. It's not dark just for its own sake. It's dark because that's the element of young adulthood that it's actively playing to. Because think back on it. Most of us go through an angsty, nobody understands me phase in our lives, and there's a reason that for most of us, this starts in adolescence. Because that's the point where we realize that the world is harsher than we were told when we were younger. But we also don't have the power or authority to do anything about it. We feel trapped by a world that couldn't care less about us. We self-doubt, we question, we get introspective in a way that tends to lower our self-esteem and our confidence. And that is the aspect of adolescence that this show is handling, which makes the darker approach actually fit the story instead of feeling like a forced attempt at superficial maturity. So, if you're not familiar with the Teen Titans, the team first appeared in the 1960s with the premise of basically putting the teen sidekicks together from some of their own adventures, various sidekicks to various adult superheroes. Now, the original team lineup, that continued on through the 70s, but it isn't really worth dwelling on that too much because it was the second iteration that served as the template for the characters that most folks now know as the Teen Titans. So, in 1980, readers were introduced to the new Teen Titans, which carried over several original members, including Robin, but more importantly, brought the character of Beast Boy over from the Doom Patrol and introduced the new characters of Cyborg, Raven, and Starfire. And it's these 5 that have become the iconic lineup of the team. They're the ones in both cartoon versions, the characters generally expected to appear when the name Teen Titans shows up. Now, this live-action Titans, it doesn't feature Cyborg, although, oddly enough, he debuted in the Doom Patrol show that launched last month. I don't know, it's weird. But as a result, we have a core group of 4 who are primarily addressed by normal names. So we have Dick, a.k.a. Robin, Rachel, a.k.a. Raven, Garfield, usually shortened to Gar, a.k.a. Beast Boy, and Corey, a.k.a. Starfire. The narrative is primarily driven by the character of Rachel, which was a good call for a number of reasons. While all the characters have their own things going on, hers is the storyline with the biggest consequences. And it means the heroes can't just hunker down and avoid what's going on. Rachel has some pretty dark powers that frighten her and terrify the woman she believes to be her mother. The angle that the show goes for is a borderline multiple personality thing, with the Raven appearing to be something that kind of takes Rachel over, as opposed to, anything that she has much control over. Now, that angle on it could have ended up being pretty cheesy, but the show does a very smart thing by making the voice of Raven bear more than a passing resemblance to the negative, hateful, and self-critical voice that many of us have in our teenage years, and sometimes well beyond them. The way in which Rachel is berated and sneered at resembles nothing so much as a manifestation of depression. That voice that will always remind you how worthless you are, no matter what else is going on around you.
No one wants you, Rachel.
So again, it's not edgy for its own sake. It fits the themes of the show that it's working with. Rachel's already turbulent world gets turned on its head when the woman she thought was her mother is killed directly in front of her, and she finds herself being tracked down by a sort of brainwashing cult that claims allegiance to her father. Fans of the character already know where that's going, but the show doesn't really tip its hand as to the specifics on that whole front for quite a while into the first season, so I'm not going to spoil that here. Just in case anybody watching doesn't already know. Going on the run puts Rachel on the radar of Dick, who's working as a police detective while simultaneously trying, and failing, to leave the life and work of Robin behind him. This, again, does a pretty solid job of handling what can and honestly has been a bit of a sticking point about this character. It doesn't bug everybody, but it does kind of bug me. And it's often struck me as odd that in the comics, Dick became a cop while still doing the vigilante justice thing, because he's essentially just doing the same job both day and night, which it doesn't give him a lot of nuance in terms of, just the potential clash of his two worlds. I mean, you can justify it as he does the work at night in a way that the rules don't let him do during the day, but it makes him kind of one note to me. Like there's nothing in his life beyond fighting crime. So here, the angle the show is working from is that Dick doesn't want to go out as Robin anymore, but is having a hard time giving it up for reasons he's not even entirely clear on himself. So becoming a cop is something that he does in hope of basically getting able to do the same work, but the legitimate version, which might mean that he wouldn't still have to go out and do the vigilante justice thing. The hope is that he won't still be on the road to becoming another Batman, which he very much does not want. Except that need, whatever's driving him to do the vigilante thing, it doesn't go away, and this gives him some pretty legitimate angst of his own. The other two characters on the show are notably less angsty, but for different reasons. Corey actually begins the show with pretty complete amnesia. She does not remember who she is, but she seems to both be in the middle of some pretty wild events and also has some devastating superpowers, mostly shooting flames from her hands. Amnesia is not exactly a bold new take on, well, anything, really. However, the approach this character has to dealing with it is basically what I, for one, have long wished more Amnesia stories would be. She naturally wants to know who she was and is working toward that goal, but she's not torn up and crying, "Who am I?" over it. I mean, she's more annoyed than anything else. She's practical. She seems to instinctively get that boo-hooing over the situation isn't going to help. And I like that. I like it a lot. She enters into the plot because she figures out that at some point prior to her losing her memory, she was looking for Rachel. And she hopes that finding this young woman, that she might be able to tell Corey who she actually is. Of course, when Corey finds Rachel, it turns out that the young girl doesn't have the first clue who Corey is. But they stick together, both in the hope that Corey can figure this out, as they go, and also because she recognizes that Rachel needs help. And then there's Gar, who's the most laid back and least burdened of the group. He's still got some moments of angst, but they're pretty light, given the fact that he was, brought back from the brink of death and is now hiding out with the Doom Patrol, lest his powers get discovered. It's worth noting, those who are fans of this particular character, he's a bit nerfed in this show. Actually, pretty much all the superpower characters are to some degree, but his is the most notable because instead of being able to turn into any animal, he only is able to turn into a tiger. Now, that does appear to be kind of his, it's his instinctive default. So there's still room for him to grow into his powers and learn other stuff, down the line. But that's all you're getting in this one. It's just the tiger. As anybody familiar with this team should expect, Gar forms the closest bond to Rachel. And thankfully, it's actually more mutual here than it's been sometimes. I've seen other iterations of the depictions of Beast Boy where I kind of felt like he was so persistent in the face of Raven telling him to buzz off that I just kind of wanted somebody to mace him. Thankfully, this doesn't fall into that particular trap. The show here just lets Gar be endearing in a way that helps lighten the mood just enough without feeling like there's nothing more to him than just being the comic relief. The bonding, growth, and dynamic of these four characters builds believably over the course of the first season, and all the actors are up to the task. I wouldn't say anybody really blew me away on the acting front, but nobody drops the ball. And given the way the team needs to fit together, that's more than enough for me. Overall, these four are the heart of the show, and also its greatest strength. In addition, it's fairly well shot. A little over dark at times, but I think we all expected that from the first trailer. It's not to the degree of, say, some of the Marvel Netflix shows where half the action scenes are so dark that you cannot tell what in the heck is even going on. And even things like, say, the violence level and the occasional bit of cursing, it feels surprisingly organic to the moments when they happen. So these are the kind of things, these sorts of elements being, harsher, they tend to feel gratuitous. But that, thankfully, was not the case here. When characters swear, it's because they're in a situation where I think pretty much any of us would have sworn too. When somebody is beaten bloody, it's in an action scene that had a narrative reason for happening, both when and how it did. So the blood, it's not just for its own sake. The show as a whole displays an impressive level of self-awareness when it comes to the aspects that I was expecting were going to derail the whole thing. Those being the angst, the darkness, the violence, etc. Now, it's not a completely smooth ride. I have mixed feelings about the cult organization that's hunting Rachel. Initially, they're presented in a way that I pretty much immediately fell in love with. Our first real introduction to them is with this family of four, who is, they are wholesome to the point of feeling like they just stepped out of a 1950s sitcom. But they're also a team of brutal assassins. And I love that contrast, especially because the nuclear family cheesiness comes across as being absolutely sincere. It reminds me of the mayor from the third season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and that is no bad thing. Unfortunately, that dichotomy diminishes as the show moves along, and we end up spending a fair amount of time with the apparent head of the cult, who is a much more standard monologuing villain type. There's still a little bit of that, that wholesomeness to him, but unlike the family, it lacks the sincerity. It feels like an act, and is therefore infinitely less engaging and entertaining. And honestly, I feel like that juxtaposition between tone and action was really the only thing that was keeping this group from just being completely generic. So as the presence of that dwindled, I just didn't really care much for or about this organization. They still function as plot drivers, but they started out as actually being more than that, so it was a bit frustrating for me as the season went on. I also want to touch on some of the guest characters who appear. One of those is Jason Todd, the new Robin, whose introduction ties pretty directly with Dick's own, questioning of his role as Robin, and it works well with that context behind it, as Dick has to contend with the idea that somebody else took up the mantle and doesn't see the danger in it that he now does. Plus, the anxiety that comes from appearing that it was incredibly easy for Batman to replace him. That makes this a totally natural inclusion, and Jason is a little bit of a prick, as you would expect. The other three guest characters in their episodes, well, a lot of them, they feel like backdoor pilots, spin-offs, where we get the hero or the hero team brought into the story, and the show really does feel like it's got one eye on the audience going, so, what do you think about this one getting their own series? Eh? Out of the three that are handled this way, one of them is about as close to seamless as these sort of things tend to be. One is far less seamless, but still pretty enjoyable. And one is just painful and annoying. The one that comes off the best, I would say, is Donna Troy, former sidekick to Wonder Woman. And she's brought in when Dick breaks off from the team for a time and basically needs somebody to confide in about the fact that he's having trouble leaving Robin behind.
Sometimes you're confrontational.
No, I'm not.
Like right now.
I'm not.
Wow. That was adult.
They have good chemistry, which helps. And also, this whole question has been eating at him the whole show already. So when he thinks Rachel's basically safe, at least for the time being, it makes sense that he turned to somebody like her for guidance. Now, a little less cleanly integrated is the Doom Patrol. They do fit into Gar's origin, but there's an entire episode that's basically devoted to little more than Rachel getting to meet each member of the team in turn and then leave with Gar in tow. And so it really does feel pretty removed from the ongoing story. So what helps is that the Doom Patrol and the team members' various inherent weirdness is just fun to watch and pretty compelling on its own. I mean, when you have a group consisting of a human mind stuck in a robot, a former movie star who's basically a big blob of putty, and a guy wrapped up in bandages for reasons that are not immediately apparent, it's not too hard to get swept up in the madness of it all. It may not push much of the overall story of the season forward, but it's fun enough to work as a one-off. Sadly, the same cannot be said for Hawk and Dove, who are not only poorly integrated into the story, they're boring, annoying, have garishly bright costumes that feel very out of place in this darker story and world, and eat up way more screen time than anybody needed. This is true of the duo collectively, but doubly true for Hawk specifically. This guy is just kind of insufferable. He's a big meathead with less brains than muscle, and he didn't have the endearing streak that was desperately needed to make me not hate every single second he's on the screen. And I know that he's supposed to be balanced out by Dove, but he needs to at least work slightly as a character on his own. These two, they get brought into the story initially because Dick thinks it might be better to have somebody else look after Rachel while he's trying to sort out what's going on, which, okay, you know what, as a concept, fair enough, but even before we understand why these two are here, we are treated to extended sequences of the pair where I just kept muttering to myself, why am I having to watch these two doofuses? It also doesn't help that later on they get a devoted origin episode after being out of the story for like 5 episodes. And that origin for them gets dropped immediately following a cliffhanger ending from the previous episode. So the story that, we're invested in gets put on pause so we can find out where these two morons came from. Folks who watched Stranger Things may actually get a little bit of deja vu between this and the much maligned episode 7 of season 2, where the main story was put on hold for a side story about an absent character. Now, I actually didn't mind it in Stranger Things because the cliffhanger in that one was one that I both saw coming in advance and had, to me, a pretty obvious immediate resolution. I wasn't going, wow, I didn't know that would happen, and I can't imagine what comes next. So it kind of worked with Stranger Things. I felt. I'm in the minority on that, whatever. But here, while I did kind of see the setup for the twist and the cliffhanger coming, it is still a twist cliffhanger that upends the dynamic of the show and puts the characters in an immediate mortal danger that does not have a clear way out. This is not the time to cut away to the origin of two characters that I had hoped I would never see again. To be fair, the origin episode isn't actually all that bad as a piece in and of itself, even though it completely wastes Marina Sirtis. But again, I don't even want an origin for these two. And this was absolutely the wrong place to put it, even if it kind of works in a vacuum. I do want to reiterate that I was actually pretty pleased with this first season, including the ending. But I can't go into more detail about that without getting into some very explicit spoilers. So while I've done my best to go spoiler light up until now, this is your warning and your cue to bow out if you don't want the last couple of episodes of this first season of Titans to be dissected in detail before your eyes. I take your not clicking off this video as informed consent. Here we go. The last 2 episodes build really well, helped initially by the genuinely creepy vibe given to the house the characters are in. There's a legitimate haunted house vibe to the entire proceeding, but it's not in that jump scare as soon as the jolt ends, the dread fades away kind of thing. No, it's slower shots, slightly off things, lingering images that disturb the characters. It creeps in without resorting to trying to startle the audience for a cheap jump. Then there's the turn of Rachel's biological mother, Angela, and the appearance of our final villain. I knew pretty much immediately that the finale was liable to somehow center around Rachel's father, the demon Trigon, because how else do you climax a show with Raven moving most of the plot? Now, I had expected that it would just end on the reveal of who Trigon was, or maybe the first hint of his return to Earth being imminent. So once I realized that, in fact, no, we're gonna get him on screen, like right now, I immediately got nervous. Because up to this point, the show had been extremely economical with its special effects. They weren't used excessively often, and they got the job done well enough because they were never too ambitious for the budget. But Trigon, a guy generally depicted like this, I really dreaded a worst-case Scorpion King style faceplant. And the finale is the worst place for that kind of thing to happen. So I was surprised again when he ended up being, for now at least, just a guy. I'll admit, actually, to a slight disappointment on that when it first happened, because despite my fear that it was going to be a special effects faceplant, I had kind of hoped to be surprised by a bonkers visualization, and this made it look like, well, they're not even trying. But then he started to speak, and I got on board pretty quickly. The casting works for me because I knew this actor from the 3 or 4 years that I watched the TV show Castle, and on that he had played a recurring supporting role as a police detective. The guy's got a very likable presence, which is perfect for what the show is doing with Trigon here. Because the show isn't doing the standard, generic, final evil villain spread darkness with his arrival as some kind of big, black, nebulous cloud of evil. No. It's a metaphorical darkness. Less tangible, but no less destructive. Trigon here is a manipulator. He's a corrupter. And having an actor with an inherent likability factor is perfect for this. This portrayal, as well as the villainous turn for Rachel's mother, also brought back that sinister domesticity, which was lost when the villains were being led by that tool I mentioned before. Now, it's not quite on the level of that assassin family, but Angela doesn't lose her softness when her evil roots are revealed, which is another wonderful avoidance of a trope that I loathe. The secret villain who, once their villainy is revealed to the audience, possibly to the heroes, not always, behaves completely differently from how they had up to that point. It happens so much, especially in superhero stories. And I get that when they're pretending to be good, that it's all an act, but it's usually such a drastic characterization shift that the results feel less like a twist in the same character and more like the character was flat out replaced by somebody else. That's not the case with Rachel's mother. She retains that softness and affection, even as she kills a man and gets ready to help bring the end of the world. And Trigon himself is not far off from being on the same line. He's playing the good cop. He wants to get you to trust him, even as he gets you to do something completely against your own best self-interest. And that's what I really love. Trigon isn't infecting or overriding people's free wills with darkness. He's putting them into circumstances that will cause them to voluntarily choose that darkness for themselves. It's done slightly heavy-handedly with using Gar's imminent death to con Rachel into bringing Trigon into the world, but after he's here, he's not cackling about being free at last. He embraces Angela and does, in fact, save Gar. And then there's what happens to Dick. So the last episode also appears at first to be disconnected from the one immediately before. But unlike the stupid Hawk and Dove origin episode, it's a disconnect that fits, because given that the previous episode ended with Dick basically crossing into the house where Trigon now has entered onto our plane of existence, having the next episode open with him happily married to Dawn, aka Dove, with one child and another on the way, sets off about 50 alarm bells that this is an unreal, artificial, and heavily manipulated situation. The show knows better than to play that as a twist or a surprise. It's pretty obvious from the get-go, and that was very smart. So instead of trying to do a rug pull with it, it uses the episode to give us a deep dive into how Trigon operates, how he corrupts, and how he gets people to choose the darkness. Because that is technically what Dick does. He makes that choice for himself. But it's also very clear that Trigon is manipulating the situation to push Dick to that point. The choice of darkness versus light is done through the lens of Dick going back to Gotham to confront a Batman who's completely lost his moral tether and is on a rampage. And every time it looks like Dick is going to make the choice that will take him further away from the darkest possible outcome, the world wobbles a bit, and then something happens that changes the situation and makes turning away all the harder. I love this for multiple reasons. Firstly, it's classic lawful evil. Trigon isn't lying when he tells Rachel that Dick chose the darkness, but he omits exactly how much nudging he had to do in order to get Dick to make that choice. And it was a lot. Batman putting criminals in the hospital doesn't drive our hero to the edge? Okay. Now he's going to kill the Joker, practically in front of Dick. Not enough? Okay. Now he's going to kill every inmate, guard, and the warden of Arkham Asylum. Still not enough to get Dick to go all the way dark? Okay. Now he's going to murder cops, and then Corey. There it is. That's enough that when Dick approaches a fallen Batman reaching out for help, he steps on his neck and kills him. He was pushed enough that he willingly submits to the darkness. But beyond the insight into Trigon's style of manipulation, I love how this speaks to the themes of the difficulty in growing up and becoming an adult. Because while Rachel, Gar, and even to a certain extent Corey are confronting the issues of teenagers, Dick is the adult in the room. But that doesn't make his life any less difficult. Because one of the things that's hard about adult life is the fact that doing the right thing is not a choice that you make once. It's a choice that you have to keep making over and over again. As situations get worse and the choice gets harder, you have to keep saying no to the nihilistic instinct to go to hell with all of it again and again and again. And even with innumerable times of making the right choice, it only takes one self-destructive, oh, fuck it, moment to do an incredible amount of possibly irreparable damage. This is a stellar closer to the first season. I love this finale as a narrative in and of itself. I love it as an Elseworlds exploration of Robin and to some extent Batman. I love what it reveals about our lead villain and his MO, and I absolutely adore how it feeds into the growing up themes of the show and these characters. This finale shows that Titans wasn't just winging it. It ties the themes together and takes them to the next level in a way that only happens when you know what you're doing and you've got a plan. I will say that I can't help but be nervous about how things pick up in the next season, because these kinds of season-ending plot twists, they have a tendency to get cleared up within the first one or two episodes before just moving on to something else. And that kind of thing, it undermines the weight of what happened. But then again, this show has already surprised me on more than one occasion with how it sidestepped the landmines that I was expecting it to step on, if only because I've seen so many other shows do it before. So, despite some hiccups along the way with a filler villain in the middle and the shoehorning in of some of the guest characters, this was a shockingly solid piece of work. While I can't say that first trailer was misrepresenting the final product, it absolutely sold it short when it comes to the depth and care with which it plays with darker plot and character turns. It made it look like it was just doing it because it was edgy. But it's there for a reason. And having now seen the reason, yeah, I gotta say I respect this. Which definitely, off that first trailer, I was not expecting to. So that's going to wrap up this one, folks. My thoughts on Season 1 of Titans. Have you seen it? What do you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them on down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Whole bunch of stuff to do down there as well. All the buttons, links, Patreon, P.O. Box. Check them out. And, or don't. That's okay too, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.